we will. Okay, so welcome to Cracks in Postmodernity's first event in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Let's hear it for this. So this evening, we invited Shadi, Hamid, and Mana Afsari to join us in a conversation about the future of freedom of speech. But before we get into the discussion, we're going to need to address the elephant in the room. And no, I'm not talking about the sensitive young MAGA boys. I'm not talking about the GOP sympathizers. Talking about the fact that Cracks in Postmodernity is a platform that's been very public about our position that not only is New York City the capital of the world, but it's also, we've also said that, you know, all culture is downstream from New York City. So you must be wondering, why is Cracks in Pomo doing an event in a cultural wasteland like DC? See, shots have been fired, yes. So I'm only half joking, of course. We'll get into the NYC versus DC beef later on. But first I want to talk about what inspired us to do this event on freedom of speech. So at Cracks in Postmodernity, we often make it clear that we're a platform whose priorities are metaphysical and aesthetic in nature. So in other words, we always focus on culture and spirituality, culture and religion. We're not explicitly political, we're not explicitly ethical, a moralistic platform, but we believe that a healthy political and ethical discourse can only proceed from a strong understanding of what is true and what is beautiful, of the metapolitical, in other words. And then we believe that the more we engage in discussion about these topics, we have the capacity to unite people who have different political points of view, different ethical points of view. That's kind of what our agenda is. And this is why we attract a broad array of readers and listeners. So we have people ranging from trad cats, we have what in New York we call BPD art hose. If you've been around Times Square, you know what I'm talking about. We have Zoomers, we have Boomers, and everyone in between. We have integralists with Vatican emojis in their X bio. We have DSA members with they, them in their bios. We have cultured New Yorkers and DC people who aspire to live in New York one day. So we have a wide array of people who follow us. And as you can tell already, Cracks in Postmodernity is also dedicated to kind of playing the role of the court jester. We think that our public discourse is a little too self-serious. I think we need to inject a little bit of humor because at the end of the day, none of us are God. None of us have the right to take ourselves that seriously. So we like to crack a few jokes now and then. So, and I also want to add that as a writer, as someone who freelances for a variety of publications, ranging from those that lean very far left, very far right, and again, everything in between. Something that's been on my mind and that kind of inspired the idea for this discussion with Shadi and Mana is that I often find that when I want to write something that's outside the box, something that's edgy, I tend to find that it's the right-leaning publications that are more open to these ideas. They're even open to ideas that are kind of more left-coded, provided I put them in a kind of right-coded language. And yet, sometimes I find that those same publications publish ideas, publish opinions that I find to be morally problematic, that lack integrity, in other words. Whereas on the right, on the left, I tend to find that the gatekeeping is much more rigorous, that there's less openness to new ideas, to ideas that challenge the status quo. But at least on the surface, there tends to be this emphasis on maintaining a high moral standard. This is why I was very much drawn to Mana's article in The Point that came out, when was it, Mana? In January of this year. So Mana did a very daring thing. She went and spent time with these sensitive young MAGA boys, some of whom might be here today. No, but I was really struck that, as she said when we did a podcast interview, she wasn't trying to analyze them from above. She didn't want to come into this in a condescending kind of way, but she was really curious to understand what is it that draws a lot of young men to the right, to post-liberal, right-leaning spaces. And she found that there's this kind of intellectual vitality, this curiosity, this openness to innovative ideas, even if they didn't totally fit with, certain conservative platforms. And it resonated very much with my experience because, again, like I find that I'm very much drawn to this intellectual curiosity, this desire to experiment with new ideas, to challenge the status quo. But again, that sometimes those very spaces put out ideas that I find don't have integrity. Now, I want to turn to Shadi's book, which came out just a few weeks ago, The Case for American Power, which also really touched on my struggle, my desire to see public discourse that is both interesting, but also that is in service of the common good. And something that kind of provoked me in Shadi's book is that, you really celebrate that America, as a democracy, is a pluralistic country, that we don't settle on a specific notion of what is the good. We're free to have very different notions, whether based on our religion, based on our philosophy, whatever it may be. And you think that this is what makes public discourse, that really brings it to life, that really, brings the debates, the arguments that we have, the dialogues, and, gives them something of substance. And I was challenged by this because I do have a very specific notion of what constitutes the good. And as much as, yes, I like that I have the freedom to espouse my personal beliefs, I wonder if the lack of a specific definition that the whole nation to ascribe to, if it really opens to the door to these ideological deadlocks between what we see, again, on the left, these kind of dogmatic speech codes, this kind of political correctness, for lack of a better term, and then what we see happening on the right now, this kind of reactionary discourse, this desire to own the libs for its own sake, even if it's not socially expedient, even if it doesn't actually contribute concretely to the common good. So I want to frame this whole discussion by asking, ultimately, how do we maintain a public discourse that is fresh, that's interesting, but also that is in service to the common good in a concrete way, in a way that actually benefits Americans' lives? So let's open up the discussion. I wanted to kind of trace how we ended up here today. So obviously, at the nation's founding, we have the First Amendment. We have this right to freedom of speech. We end up today, again, at this deadlock between this kind of emphasis on moral righteousness, on ethics, and freedom, between enforcing speech codes and celebrating reactionary rhetoric. How do we characterize this overarching trajectory? How do we end up where we are today? Who wants to start us?
I don't have a lot to characterize the general trajectory as. I think it'd be very hard to sum it up in one way or another. And I have former colleagues at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression here who could probably do a better job than I could. But I do think that in many ways, after the sort of tendency toward censorship that we did see during the Biden era, we do live in a time that's more friendly to free speech than I think we ever have. And that comes to a lot of negative things, like say the rise of Fuentes, or honestly, a lot of AI-generated speech is particularly helpful or reductive to public discourse. But I'd say if you look at the entire scope of human history and the myriad ways we have to communicate, we probably live in a better climate now than ever for free speech. And we'll never live in one that's ideal and involves not hearing things that we think shouldn't be allowed to talk.
That's interesting. That's a more optimistic view than I would have maybe anticipated. I'm a little bit more skeptical because, the right was promising to be the party of free speech, and we heard that endlessly during the Biden years. And I think at that time I was in the anti-woke coalition, if you will. I don't love that kind of term, but I was definitely woke skeptical. And I was very critical of this tendency towards censorship and self-censorship, this fear of saying things that we knew were true and right, but we couldn't say them for fear of moral blacklisting. So I probably had some optimism that if, as much as I disliked Donald Trump and opposed him, that maybe one positive thing would be the kind of breaking of the woke fever, if you will. And that has happened in part. There is more openness on the left to talk about certain things that were considered out of bounds. Trans rights, gender identity, and so forth. You can do much more of that now, and more Democratic politicians are coming out and expressing that. That's on the good side of the ledger. On the bad side of the ledger is, I think, the most frightening attack on free speech that I've seen in my lifetime from the Republican Party, particularly on pro-Palestine speech. And using that as a cudgel, using a kind of justified fears of anti-Semitism, but using them politically, weaponizing that to target universities and withdraw their funding, and to pressure universities to essentially toe a particular line, not just on Israel-Palestine, but on a whole host of other issues. And to see state power being used in that way, in such an aggressive manner. I mean, as much as we criticize our universities, that's part of what makes America great. I think we forgot about that. We were so intent on attacking Harvard, Yale, and Princeton that we forgot that that's what drew a lot of people to America, and that's why we were the pinnacle when it came to higher education. And Columbia, I should have mentioned as well, of course. But Columbia now, I think, is becoming unrecognizable. It's not the institution it once was. There are now speech codes in place that create a culture of fear in a way that I think is worse than what we saw during the Biden years. In terms of what that means more broadly, I think, unfortunately, what the conclusion that I've come to, no one really believes in free speech, except maybe the three of us here, and you guys, of course. No, but it is a kind of minority position, and I think we have to not take it for granted that believing in free speech, everyone says they believe in it, everyone says, oh yeah, the Bill of Rights, great, but it's actually really hard to do it. And we'll probably talk about that more, but I think that's probably, we'll talk about those tensions, yeah.
I want to get into a little bit more into the present moment, and maybe to push back a little bit on what your more optimistic view, Mana, because again, this question of the overall trajectory, how do we end up where we are here today? I mean, surely freedom of speech used to be a very explicitly left-coded issue. When we think back to the Vietnam days, when we think to the Berkeley protests, we're fast forwarding to the Biden era, when we have the mainstreaming of woke, of all these politically correct speech codes. Now we see freedom of speech becoming a right-coded issue, that we should be free to make off-color jokes, to say whatever, we see that becoming a right-wing kind of issue. But as you're alluding to now, Shadi, I think we see, at least with Trump 2.0, the rise of the woke right. So in other words, the banning of anything that smells like DEI, anything that whiffs a little bit of the previous form of political correctness. It's been interesting to me to see how much, this platform, which kind of championed itself as an advocate for freedom of speech, is now instituting new speech codes. And it goes back to your point, Shadi, like, does anybody actually believe in freedom of speech? Why is it that there's this new kind of book, this new kind of language policing? So I mean, Mana, I'm curious if you can comment, because personally I feel more free to say a lot more things that I couldn't before, at least compared to 10 years ago. But it does concern me that this reactionary impulse, which to me doesn't seem like an actual commitment to freedom of speech. It seems like we want to swing the pendulum the other way in order to own the libs, to own the opposition. It's not an actual desire to have a free public discourse. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what do you observe happening? Do you fear some of the kind of overswinging of the pendulum that we see going on right now?
I think whichever way the pendulum swings, we can't control as individuals. And so we can sit here and be concerned about it. We should raise concerns as they come to our minds. But I just don't see this as a left and right issue. I mean, free speech doesn't exist to protect the right or the left at different times in history. It didn't exist in the 1960s to protect the left. It just was instituted and honored, with a very spotty record across our nation's history. But it's more a question of the social and the individual. Freedom of speech recognizes the tendency in human nature to want to follow the dictates of a social mood, of a dogma, of an existing creed, over the sort of free expression of the individual mind. Now, of course, there may not be that many active individual minds out there. It depends on how optimistic you are about the capacity for human reason. But, I mean, sometimes the unpopular position is left-wing, sometimes it's right-wing. But I think to say that well, gosh, the left no longer believes in free speech, and the right no longer believes in free speech, is just another form of missing the point, which is that people who are interested in serious intellectual contestation want to be around people who are interested in serious intellectual contestation, and they're grateful for free speech. It's a doctrine that honors the sacred need to exchange ideas, to think and to rethink, and to have freedom of conscience. And it's not a question of political temperament. There are some creeds and ideas and ideologies that don't support freedom of speech, or don't really respect the capacity for human reason as something that's universal. Right? I think certain strains of Marxism deny the idea of a free, independent, roving mind, independent of material circumstance. Obviously, many forms of fascism do as well. Certain religious doctrines don't honor freedom of conscience. But it's really, I think, the reason I care about free speech is always going to be political. And I think, so what if people on the right are having a reactionary attitude and they think temporary like freedom of speech? And so what if the left has recently rediscovered the value of it? As somebody who's an intellectual and just wants to talk to other people who have a serious commitment to ideas, I'll take that for what it is. I think I have more sort of knee-jerk support of the Constitution because of this, because I'm not really interested in sort of passing intellectual trends. If one were to follow passing intellectual trends on what the right is more free speech or the left is, I'd never have an original idea anyway. So I just don't think it's useful to keep count of different scores between the left and the right, because free speech has never been about whether the left or the right likes it more. It's not about the individual versus the social law. From the earliest theorizers of the sort of idea of free speech. In the British sort of common law system, but also in the Enlightenment that formed our Constitution.
Shadi, can I ask you, so what? I mean, is it really... No, I mean, to Anna's point, that like, the political parties are going to do what they're going to do. As individuals, we have the freedom to exercise our freedom of speech. So what if, you know, the loudest voices in the room are swinging the pendulum back and forth? Do you agree that it's, so what?
I want to clarify my so what, right? I think the first real political commitment I had emerging from university was going to work at FIRE and knowing that the most productive thing I could do in the summer of 2020 was to support basic, not just constitutional principles, but basic principles of a liberal society, or ones that I think are really pre-liberal in a way, that support the needs of the human spirit. So it's not so what if the government is suppressing speech. The one thing I would point out is that I think the left-right debate over free speech is very similar to the sort of Zionist and pro-Palestine debate about free speech. There were speech codes at universities well before there was ever censorship of Palestinian speech. There were speech codes well before it was more left-wing environment or right-wing environment. This issue has repeated over and over again. And so to identify it specifically to the political cause that you feel is most infringed upon, perhaps very much rightly so, is misleading. Are you committed to the pre-political principle that we should be engaged in seriously contesting ideas, or are you committed to some sort of idea of unity that includes them? That's much more significant than whether the most recent abuse of free speech or not.
I think the question of power here is really important, that free speech is so critical because it helps those who lack state power and who lack a powerful position in society to have the freedom to object to their government. So it's not a surprise, it's kind of the subtext of what we've been talking about so far, that when the right is in power, the left rediscovers the importance of free speech. When the left is in power, the right loves free speech more than ever. And I think we should just be aware of that dynamic going forward, that pendulum will probably keep on shifting. My hope is that when we on the left, if we on the left regain power, I have to presume it'll happen eventually, that we will learn the lessons of the past 5 or 6 years, and there will be enough of us within the kind of progressive Democratic Party tent to say we should never go back to peak woke, because that's what provoked the right-wing reaction. People end up hating and sort of feeling so stifled by wokeness that they wanted revenge. And it's understandable where that desire would come from. And I think that that's the risk here, that it keeps on going back and forth with each side wanting to exact revenge on whoever was in power before. That's why someone has to break the cycle. And that's where being self-critical about your own side is important. I would like my side, when it has power, to break the cycle and to not return to this kind of policing of the right wing. But am I optimistic about that? I don't know, but I do think what parties and leaders of parties do and say is important, because unfortunately in a very partisan, polarized environment, individuals take cues from what the party leaders are saying. So if Donald Trump is not exactly upholding free speech, then his supporters will follow suit. But I agree with Mana that this is a value that it should transcend political division. It should be so essential to who we are. But I think sometimes we free speech advocates, we have trouble explaining why free speech is so important. Even if you ask me now, I'd probably struggle. I mean, I have an answer, but that's because I value certain things. But do I believe that the best ideas rise to the top? That's often one of the arguments you hear for free speech. It's the best way of sort of surfacing the right ideas or the common good. That if we have a totally free environment, naturally, inevitably, we'll come to good decisions about our common society. I'm not sure that's the case, and I worry that if we tie free speech too closely to a kind of consequentialist argument that free speech is good because it produces good outcomes, then we end up being in trouble when free speech doesn't produce good outcomes.
I just also briefly add that I think it's also a process question. I think one of the reasons that I don't think it's inherently left or right wing, and certainly not inherently right wing really, that the right wing magazines you wrote with were more open to sort of interesting ideas, so long as it sort of basically accorded with their broader worldview and agenda. I think it's more that it's institutions and power, right? I think the desire for intellectual playfulness, for openness, for talking about things is a temperamental desire, much more. I mean, I just kind of the tendency that's informed my writing to think that a lot of things are, yes, definitely about ideas, but the way that we approach them have more to do with temperamental and psychological needs and human needs than they do than any one policy. So I feel that many mainstream outlets, I could name a few, just generally don't have the appetite for something that's kind of unusual or strange. And that's, when the right has its version of the New York Times, I imagine it's going to be relatively dogmatic or just attempting to be legible in a very predictable way too, the same way you see with other mainstream outlets. So at Fire, I often thought we have really good theories for why free speech is important, but it's not an end, it's a means. And so how do we actually practice it in a way that's worthwhile? That's at the level of the individual. It's not about whether the right is doing something bad or the left is.
Wait, so that's interesting. So you see it more as a means, not as an end unto itself.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a more instrumentalist view.
It's like, I think it's an inviolable right. So in that sense, it's ultimate in terms of its good. But it's not, this is something that was told to me in my interview at Fire when I first started working there. It's by the executive director that it's not just this thing in itself that you need to worship. Like we actually think about how do we practice this value. Frankly, just like anything else, like whether it's a piece of music or a lived culture, if you don't practice it, it dies. It doesn't matter how much theoretically you value the thing. If you don't actually practice free speech, it will die. And in my experience, the people who've been most interested in hearing out interesting and difficult ideas, one which I think, my article is something that most people didn't want to hear or listen to, certainly not the opinions of sensitive young men. I mean, even in your introduction, like we still have this hesitance about people who may disagree with us, may hold those views. The appetite for that, the lack of an appetite for that was not necessarily political, though obviously many more left-wing people had no interest in this idea. It was more just like a temperamental, like, is there something I can understand about people that I think I don't already know? And that's kind of temperamental. So it's not really instrumentalistic. I don't have an ending goal with free speech. I don't want to end the Vietnam War or support Israel or any one issue, right? I have a much more sort of ultimate, but also practice-based appreciation of the thing.
I do agree that right-wing circles and magazines have been better at fostering certain kinds of debates. I totally agree on that, and I think it's worth thinking about why that is. And I think there is something intrinsic to a certain strain of progressivism that treats all of the important questions as having been resolved. That is the idea of progress, that we can actually get to an endpoint where history ends, where there is no more deep foundational ideological debate. That was the post-ideological dream. And I think that that continued kind of tendency of seeing progress as something that has to be protected at all costs against the enemies of progress, and the idea that a certain kind of left liberalism is the end state, and everyone who is good-natured and well-meaning should naturally incline towards the liberal left. I think that is a view that is very predominant in left-wing circles, that there is only one answer. And if we continue thinking that way, I think we're always going to be in tension with the ideals of free speech, because we've decided what we want the outcomes to be, progressive outcomes. And if the right stands in the way of that, they have to be suppressed. So getting outside of that kind of mindset, but again, it's an uphill battle to make.
I suppose just one more thing is that when I talk about free speech not being an end in itself, what are we using it for? It's for the joy, I mean, for me at least, and many people may have different ideas. Some people enjoy provocation, sure. But for me, it's the joy of understanding the world better, of coming to recognize somebody else's sort of, human aspirations underlying the way that they think about the world. Temperamentally, I really enjoy talking to people that I don't fully understand. That's not a shared temperament, but it's a faculty that has to exist in society that we all claim that we want to live in. I think the anti-intellectual bent of progressive spaces that existed for a time was not necessarily unique to them. We're seeing that now in sort of some right-wing spaces that prioritize being supposedly aligned or based or whatever amongst each other. Whether it's the so-called woke right or other factions, whether it's Zionist or the America First movement that Tucker Carlson represents, that I think also has anti-intellectual strains. I mean, this is just a human nature thing, to impugn the motives of somebody you're talking to who you don't understand, to assign an agenda. It's as simple as, I've frequently observed this intellectual movement when somebody brings with an idea, they impugn an agenda to them, beneath what they must actually think. And this sense is very common in progressive spaces, but it can exist in any space. And so I think when we talk about free speech, it falls on flat ears because it sounds like saying the free market or the marketplace idea. It's just a grown out. But do we want to be able to understand how our fellow citizens think? It's kind of a spiritual temperament as well. The peak woke crowd and the sort of super based crowd tend to have a belief that you can sideline all political disagreement and you're going to just keep winning. And there's never going to be a moment you have to actually persuade people. You can just keep ratcheting up the temperature. But ultimately, in 2016, as a college student, I just felt that a lot of people around me did not want to have people who disagreed with them as their fellow citizens. They just didn't. And I thought that was offensive, honestly, to the democracy I was living in. And so it's a delusion that can affect both sides, and it's going to, inevitably. And if you have any sort of long-term trajectory in mind, your only goal should be to follow the original ideas that come to you, continue to practice whatever we might call free speech, but seriously, it's just intellectual life on your own. And of course resist state power as much as you can when you feel that it's going after things that are pre-political and should not be negotiated.
So I want to return to differences we see between left and right circles in a moment, but I want to kind of zoom out and look at this bigger question of these pre-political matters you guys keep bringing up, and ultimately the question of what is good, because this is what I've been struggling with. Because when Mana frames it as a matter of, so freedom of speech both is an instrumental good because it fosters a lively public discourse, but also that there's something essentially good about it because it affirms the freedom of conscience. When you frame it that way, I recognize the value of it. When it's freedom of speech for its own sake, because we're free, because it's a liberal democracy, because we're a free nation, I mean, that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, freedom for its own sake is not necessarily good. And now to your point, Shadi, in the book, that you say that this kind of pluralistic openness to various definitions of the good is positive because, again, like it sustains a lively public discourse. We can debate and arrive to various conclusions about what is good. I have a hard time with that, kind of because of Mana's point that, like, if you recognize, I mean, on a spiritual level, as you said, like temperamentally, you're open to engaging with different people because it's interesting, but also because it's conducive to forging unity, forging a more robust and meaningful social fabric. If we can't say this is objectively a good thing, and that our society, our public discourse should be arranged around this thing that is objectively good, I worry because then if we don't say that this is objectively good, there's a good in itself that applies to all of us, that's universal, I fear that we end up with the pendulum, that we have the people who want to invent these arbitrary moral rules about what is allowed to be said, what can't be said, which are extremely authoritarian. They end up becoming very authoritarian. Or you have the just pure reactionary, let's say things because we want to be free to say them, even if they're offensive, even if they demean people. So, I mean, I want to start with you, Shadi, because I felt very challenged by what you said in the book. If we don't have a specific understanding of what is the good, is it possible to foster a genuinely good public discourse in a society in general? I mean, how do we avoid swinging back and forth between these extremes, which are not good?
So, I mean, I like the idea of the common good in principle, but when I hear people talking about it, it makes me nervous. Because the question that arises immediately is who decides? It's ultimately a question of power. Whoever has power decides what the common good is and then can proceed to impose it on the rest of society. If we lived in a more homogenous country, then I think there would be a stronger case to make for coming to some kind of consensus. But because we are a very and somewhat unusually fractious country, unwieldy country in ideological, political, religious, and ethnic terms, we have so many of these cleavages, especially now. To try to get enough people to agree on one particular course of action is very challenging. And I worry that where we find ourselves now, which is not in a great place, is in part a result of specific groups of Americans trying to promote a narrow conception of the common good and insisting that that is the only way for everyone else. And this is why I'm not a big fan of consensus, because consensus by definition requires deciding who to exclude from the consensus. And this is the way Biden would talk. He would talk about, most presidents do this. They talk about unity, consensus, coming together. But what they really mean is coming together on their own terms. They're not actually extending a hand and saying, come into a bigger tent. So I have my own views about what the common good is and should be. I just don't know if it's applicable to America because of where we are, and I worry that it's too dangerous to try to build that consensus because we do have foundational disagreements, and this is where I think this is maybe part of the modern state of being. In most modern societies, they're very diverse. People don't agree on the big questions. We don't agree on what it means to be American. We don't agree on what being American actually means. We have foundational divides over religion, stark divides between religiously minded people and secular folks. And I think in this sense, because I used to focus a lot on the Middle East was sort of, during the Arab Spring, was a preview in some ways of what America would become when you have people who are so divided over questions of religion, ideology, and identity. And when you have that situation, the only thing that you can do, in my view, is fall back on democracy as the organizing principle. That we agree to respect democratic outcomes, we respect alternation of power, we accept that we're going to lose eventually. Each side has to accept that one day we'll lose and not be in power. And there is, I think, a common sense of being American. We just don't agree on what that common sense is, but I think we are, most of us, actually it's not true, we're not all proud to be American anymore, that's changed. I was going to say, I mean, some of the polling on this is pretty worrying, but I think at some fundamental level, there is still something about being American that animates people. Even if in some polling, the Gallup poll that in 2025, only 36% of Democrats are either extremely or very proud to be American, and that's down from close to 90% in the early 2000s. It's one of the most precipitous drops in polling that I've ever seen. So we have a problem there, but I do think there is still something about it being American, but we can't be too specific about it because then we're closing the tent.
I think there's one sign of hope, but also there's a negative side to this too when it comes to thinking about the common good. I think most people would be surprised at the idea that what's important for maintaining a fractious society is not that we agree, right, or that we come to all have similar views about American, or about gender, or about sexuality, or about immigration. But the things that I notice when I talk to young people on the right and people on the left about what disturbs them the most about their fellow citizens that disagree with them, is when they feel that they violate the rules of the common democratic game. Now, this should give us some heart because they actually still care about the rules in a real way. Like, what I know bothers, say, young men on the right much more than whether somebody disagrees with them about gay marriage or immigration or any number of issues, about whether Trump really is or isn't a fascist. What actually bothers them is when they see people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death. What actually bothers them are violations of the sort of social contract that they think that should be non-political, like whether political violence is a role in our ecosystem. That is a political question, but the presumption, for I think a majority of Americans is that it doesn't. When people feel that they can't coexist with their fellow citizens, that's when I think they feel the line's been crossed. Or when supporters of Palestine feel that if you are pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel, you could be deported over that view. They feel like that's a violation of a sort of community contract about the issue. And so it should give us some hope that what people find most disturbing about public discourse is not when there's disagreement, but when there's a sense that people just don't want to play the game with you at all. And so I think that if there's going to be a common good that we're going to start with, I could have much more lofty ideas of what I would like the common good to be. But foundationally, I think the biggest threat to us as a country is that a lot of people simply feel like they can't coexist with other Americans because those Americans don't want them around, they don't want them in the political ecosystem. Sometimes they get so frightened as to say other Americans want them dead for disagreeing with them. I mean, that's the real threat, much less than any one faction over another.
No, I agree with Shadi that I don't want to live under a theocracy or an autocratic regime. But when you bring up people celebrating public figures' death, I come back to this question. I mean, if we don't have a clear notion of the good, who is to say that that's a bad thing? I mean, if in your eyes he represented something that was not socially expedient, then why not celebrate his death? If life is sacred and it is wrong to be happy when someone dies and gets killed, I mean, this is my fear. But I mean, to Shadi's credit, I do want to bring up, throughout the book you do mention de Tocqueville in a positive light. For me, this is the only way out of this deadlock, because again, I don't want to live under a theocracy. I am very skeptical about this kind of liberal setup this liberal pluralistic setup where we're free to decide what the good is, and ultimately to decide that nothing is good and that everything's arbitrary, nothing's sacred. I think ultimately, if we return to some of de Tocqueville's observations about the nature of the setup of this country, that, it was never meant to operate. If you look at mass media today, if you look at the fact that first of all, you never really hear about local news, local stories, it's always national or international, but also that it's in very large global corporations that regulate the narratives that are disseminated into public discourse. I think it's really hard to have these challenging debates about what is sacred, what is good, what is right and wrong, if it's always happening in this very abstract field, if it's never happening on the ground, if there's no civic society, if there are no local avenues to have these tough conversations, where you actually have to look someone in the face and see, like, this is a person. Even if we have different views about what is good, if there's a God, etc. It's easy to denigrate the dignity of a person if it's someone out in the ether and it's someone not in front of me. So I'm curious, I mean, if you have any thoughts on, like, whether on the Tocqueville or the kind of breakdown of the civic society and how that makes it harder to have a better public discourse.
Oh, yeah, okay, sure, okay. Yeah, I think we all know that something went wrong and that we're bowling alone and all that, and there isn't a kind of rich associational life in America the way it used to be. There's not a lot we can do about that. I mean, some of those changes I think are permanent just because of the way modern society has evolved. And of course we can talk about the rise of the smartphone and other things like that can't, the effects of them can't really be undone. So, we can lament it, but I don't know how far that really takes us in terms of coming up with a constructive way forward. But I do think that Tocqueville's work points to what makes American democracy special, which is there's a kind of vibrancy to it. There's an aliveness to it. And part of that is because our state has not been as overbearing as European states. This is one thing that we should remember. I mean, it's interesting that when you talk to Europeans, not to overgeneralize, but they will talk about the state. And I remember finding that really odd the more time I spent in European countries, because growing up, I don't remember my parents or anyone around me, or even in school, we would never use the phrase the state. And it's just something to keep in mind. Just keep an eye on it next time you're traveling abroad, how people talk. And it's understandable. The state does a lot more in the generous welfare states of Europe than here. So there is a dark side to that as well. And we have to think about, like, where do we want the trade-off to be there. I do think there's something very important about in-person interaction, and I'm actually a good example of this. I don't want to say like I'm a people pleaser, but I don't like a lot of conflict in person. I don't know if you guys agree, or maybe some people in the audience will disagree with this. I do think that I'm pretty agreeable in person. I think when my more aggressive side comes out, it's when I'm writing. Because I'm not necessarily talking to someone in particular and seeing them. I mean, I try to be self-aware about that, and I try to correct for that. But I think it is a normal thing for people. And there's someone who, I don't want to name names, but there was one author, writer in particular, who would write these substacks entirely about me. He had like a series, like part 1 and part 2, about how bad Shadi Hamid is. But when we met in person for the first time, it actually wasn't that bad. And we were on the same panel together, and he was respectful, and I was respectful, and we even agreed on quite a bit. And I'm like, this guy's pretty cool. I don't know if he thinks I'm pretty cool still, but I mean, I think, yeah, it's a very banal kind of thing to say, but we should value in-person interaction. I just don't know how to do that at scale. And we can do more things like, I mean, it's good that DC has events like this. And
New York too.
New York too, apparently.
I guess it's partly a question of, I think, a lot of spaces where there would be opportunity for people to interact with people that they don't share assumptions with. Social life has been degraded since or even before COVID, right? And that affects the way that we date, the way that we talk about ideas, the way that we socialize at all. I mean, if you don't understand that left or right, young people are getting their intellectual, social, emotional information on the internet, then you don't understand anything that's happening. And the norms of conversation also follow suit. I mean, I think more than left or right or any other consideration, people in my generation and younger, and certainly older, I think millennials definitely suffer from this, just can't usually deal with confrontation or don't like to initiate it, particularly in person. And I think some thinkers, like say Helen Andrews, consider this as a feminine versus a masculine sort of type of disagreement. There's certainly there's some truth to that. I don't know if the way that she puts it is true, but there is some truth to this idea. And I think part of what you're seeing in the sort of tendency for young men, but not just on the right, because I think it's underappreciated how much of, say, like Fuentes' fans are also left-wing or just kind of anarchic or all over the map. This tendency just to sort of push the boundaries of what's acceptable to say, and the changing around the social permission structure about whether you can say things that are ostensibly racist or anti-Semitic or X, Y, and Z, is more of a rebellion against like a lifetime of growing up with largely like female teachers or otherwise spaces where there were social but not intellectual limits on what you could say. Like you shouldn't say this because it's socially inadvisable as opposed to intellectually. And when I do see somebody who's just disagreeable, which is so rare these days actually to find somebody who's disagreeable in person, will just say that's a stupid idea, why would you say that? And then actually force you to sort of make your point and engage with it. Then very quickly you see people who might say something that doesn't make a ton of sense, whether it's like a Trump card on the left that's like, oh, well, it's just structural racism. And then you say, well, what does that actually mean? Explain it to me. Or if somebody just says, well, it's all of these like terrible Jews. It's like, actually, okay, explain that point then. What do you actually mean by that? I don't think we have enough people who are disagreeable in the slightest. And you can say that's more masculine than virtue. I think there's some truth to that. But as a sort of social world, in the Anglophone world, we don't have enough open disagreements or confrontation, and we could use a lot more. And I think to Shadi's credit, he says he's a people pleaser, which he is. He's a very pleasant person. He likes to, and very agreeable in person. But I think it's his book, he has a lot of stomach for being told that he's just a contrarian or he's causing too much difficulty. I mean, the guy sketched out a vision saying we shouldn't hate America, and he's gotten so much flack for doing this. Basically everywhere that's not the MAGA nationalists, right? And that's preposterous and insane. And I'm grateful to him for sort of sketching out that case, because I think it shows that he has a genuinely like meta-political commitment to just saying things that he thinks are true and sharing his original thoughts and being able to defend what should be pretty non-controversial ground.
Yeah, and again, to Shadi's credit, there are plenty of...
I like this, I like this.
Yeah, we'll keep flattering you. No, I mean, I was genuinely challenged by a lot of points you made in the book, but what made it compelling and what made it worth engaging with these challenges was the fact that you made it very clear that none of these points you were making you didn't arrive at any of them automatically. Like you really struggled to arrive at these points. And you acknowledge the shortcomings, you acknowledge potential flaws within the position you're taking. And you also, I mean, what's interesting is seeing the kind of journey you've made from your last book to this one. Like you kind of shifted your position. It's rare to see people who own up to the fact that, you know what, I'm not completely sure about this position I'm taking. Like, I am going to take a position, but I see potential shortcomings. I see why some people might think I'm wrong, but I'm going to take this stance anyway. I don't see that happening very much. And it goes back to, I think, this point you're making, Mana, about the need, especially for younger men, to be challenged by mature male fatherly figures, to reconsider their positions, not because, that's socially incorrect or because it's offensive, but because it's not completely logical. It doesn't completely hold up. I think there definitely is a lack of those types of figures to challenge guys to think more deeply. And I do, before we kind of wrap things up, I do want to ask you just to share a little bit more about the specific things that you observed while you were reporting, while you were doing your research on this article. And again, I found that it resonated with me because again, like my priorities as a writer are not political. They're always cultural. They're always meta-political. And yet, the reality is I do end up finding myself more in right-leaning spaces, even though I disagree with much of what is said in them, because there seems to be more of this intellectual curiosity. But also, like, I'll make some kind of extremely left-coded argument, and they'll freak out, but they'll be like, well, why are you saying that? What do you mean? If I'm doing that in a left-wing space, at least in my experience, it's like, that's problematic. We gotta get him out of here. We can't contend with a problematic idea. So yeah, I mean, tell us, what did you see? I mean, why is that the case that at least right now, there seems to be more of a space for experimentation, for curiosity within MAGA, right-coded, post-liberal spaces?
I mean, so I'll go to the etiology of it, the cause of it in a moment. But I think you're right to mention for the end there that it's not just, it's very easy to be overly critical of like this like phantasm or scapegoat, the sensitive young men. Like they're not the only people who need to be asked what they actually, like asked to explain their position or to be told like maybe you're wrong and that's dumb. That is not an impulse that's well practiced in left-leaning spaces or in mainstream spaces. So it was more vibrant, say maybe a year ago on the right. The capacity for it has shrunk since then, depending on where you look. And I think it's largely not because we don't have enough people who say that being anti-Semitic is wrong, but because we don't have enough people in any of the spaces that are sufficiently disagreeable or able to contest ideas in a really non-confrontational way. When I was in campus, in like 2018, and trying to speak to people who thought that, if you were male or white or whatever, you didn't have a right to have an opinion on a subject. The people who felt most like offended by that impulse were not actually just white men or people who were most targeted by it, but people who were in the natural sciences or in disciplines where like genuine contestation and confrontation is necessary and normal. Like the professors who, when I would in a seminar, object to the inability to just contest something because somebody was really open to having a real conversation. The people who were most put off by that environment on campus were almost always like physicists or people maybe in psychology, just in disciplines that were not prone to sort of like sloppy reasoning, honestly, to some extent, but also people who are used to the idea that you have to logically reason your way towards something that's right. In terms of why the right has this vitality, I mean, it's not necessarily something in the right. I mean, you could say that I think the right is more prone to having an aspiration toward ideals and standards, but there's of course room for that on the left, and there was historically. I think before, as you would put it, post-modernity. But I mean, the reason the right has been is open for realignment is because Donald Trump sort of broke the institutional right. I don't think that the bow tie Bush era conservatives were that like intellectually dynamic. They were, I think, relatively married to the ideas of Russell Kirk and Milton Friedman, and there wasn't that much room for contestation. But and there also wasn't a lot of the more sort of erratic right-wing speech that you see as well. I mean, it's a structural reason, if anything. But like I said before, I think the anti-intellectual impulse cannot be chalked up to right or left. It was absolutely the case even in the talk last year at Sud House. I spoke to somebody who was liberal, and I said, I just really like archaeology. I find it so interesting. I do. And she said, well, aren't you kind of worried about how fascists reappropriate archaeology for their nationalistic ends? Like that sort of like assumption of an agenda on something that might be interesting to say that something is right-coded or left-coded is definitely an impulse you see more often in left-wing spaces. But of course it has and will continue to pop up on the right. And so I think it's much more of a quick commitment to whether you want to be a serious person or not, to whether there are these anti-intellectual strains that always reoccur, than it is unique to the right or the left. But as it stands, I'll say I know a lot of conservative, so-called conservative, like right-wing young men who admire Mao, or who admire communist thinkers, or who find something much more populist or free market. I mean, the scope of what it means to be conservative. Some of them are monarchists, and some of them are integralists, and some of them are democratic. I mean, it's a huge range of things, and I think the left now has an opportunity, given how discredited it is, to be on the back foot as well and discover its new identity. I mean, the right was on the back foot for such a long time. That's why they were willing to accept unusual pitches from people like you and me, to write about things, because frankly they didn't have the institutional credibility. The New York Times can say, no, I'm not so interested in your idea, it's a little bit out there, or I don't honestly understand it, because I could have, like David Bergschreider call me tomorrow. But the right for a long time didn't have that credibility, and so it was hungry for ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll add to this point about the left having an opportunity to kind of open up. I mean, I saw it the day after the presidential election when several left-leaning publications acknowledged like, we kind of screwed up with not just Harris, but with everything woke. That the obsession with the speech codes, but also this the fact that the establishment left has lost touch with, as Bernie put it, bread and butter issues. And that Bernie, wrote this public letter saying, the left it's over. You need to start from scratch now. Which to me, I mean, I'm starting to see, at least within publishing world, like I'm starting to see left-leaning publications kind of give up on the speech codes and start to engage with bread and butter issues, a more left populist platform, but also just like kind of dropping the elitist front and like trying to be in touch with the people. So like I do have hope for that. But just to kind of wrap things up, I do want to end on a hopeful note. And I'll share this. We'll do questions. We'll do just a discussion later.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Because you never know who's in the crowd. You can't trust these people sometimes. We're not pro free speech. That's the moral of the story. No, so before we engage in actual discussion with each other, just everyone. No, so to end on a hopeful note, so I'll share this and then I want to hear from you guys. So I've been in education on both the secondary and college levels for over almost 10 years now. And I struggled a lot seeing how much my students had a hard time generating original thoughts. And I attributed a lot to social media, especially to TikTok, because I remember the point where students would start like espousing certain ideas, and I'd be like, okay, well, where did you hear that? How did you come up with that? Oh, I saw a TikToker. I'm like, okay, but first of all, how do you know what they're saying was true? And also, do you believe that? Or are you just mimetically regurgitating what you heard? Because you associate it with a particular tribe. You think this tribe is good, this TikToker is part of it, so I'm just going to say it. But do you really think that? At a hopeful moment this semester, I'm teaching college freshmen, and the week that Charlie Kirk was killed, we were reading Plato's Cave. And I was really shocked because one of the students said, reading this story, it makes me think that we hear all these different narratives about what actually happened with Charlie Kirk. Who was Charlie Kirk, whether he was good or bad. And now we're all like want to kill each other over these differing opinions. If you post, rest in peace Charlie, we associate you with this side and you're evil, and vice versa. And one of the kids is like, well, who's really behind this all? Like, where are these narratives coming from? Are they true? Why do we hate each other so much? And a bunch of them are like, yeah, I mean, Plato's onto something here, kind of making us question where the narratives come from, and what's really going on. What is reality in the first place? So as much as, I struggled with just the lack of this capacity for original thinking, like I'm starting to see something new coming up. I'm starting to see a desire to not hide in these ideological silos and to really ask, well, what is going on for real? And who is the person sitting next to me beyond the person who's on the left or right? I'm curious if you see any hopeful things opening up within public discourse, any things that give you hope for the future of free speech in this country.
I would say more broadly, my sense is that the kind of muddying and proliferation of speech that happens on the internet and increasingly with AI and all these other things, with short form videos and just the fact that our entire lives are virtually mediated online if you choose that to be the case, it's going to shallow intellectual thought in general. That's probably more likely than not going to happen. I think whether you're committed to freedom of speech, which again I think is a prerequisite but not the sufficient for a vibrant intellectual life, which is my primary priority, then you have to be willing to be a public or a private intellectual in your own capacity. It's not, I don't ever allow, I lived through a period when I was in college and shortly thereafter when governments used misinformation and sort of internet speech and all these other things to come up with states of emergency that would license, and that happens in left and right-wing administrations, though obviously perhaps often more one side than the other, to license states of emergency that would shut down speech overall. And I think if you're committed to having your mind be an interesting place to live for the rest of your life, finding serious people that you can have conversations with, it's going to be a lonely battle as tech mediates more of our life either way. And teaching is an important vocation to sort of spark that genius in somebody younger. But that battle will continue regardless. So I'm a little less concerned with free speech how free speech is affected in different countries. I think the United States is wonderful. I wouldn't want to live in Britain, for instance. But I think just be wary that even if you believe that everybody on the right is a bigot who hates you and wants to hurt you, and if you believe everyone on the left would want to kill you the same way somebody killed Charlie Kirk, whatever you think the enemy is, I'd say more broadly, if you're a serious person and you want to live a life that's vibrant and interesting and allows you to have freedom of conscience and to care about the things that you do care about and your governing passions, I wouldn't allow anybody to give you a pretext to shut down speech in any meaningful way. You're never going to have a fully sanitized public square, not because of the right or the left, but because honestly, as Plato would say, human psychology is made up of a lot of passions and a lot of sometimes base impulses, and that's never going to change. So I would say it's much more the individual free roaming mind against, tech, sloth, whatever you want to call it. And of course, honestly, against the state. I'm comfortable saying that.
Okay, so I'll start with the negative, and I'll try to maybe end on a positive note, maybe not. So I think I've been tested by this moment. I've always been an advocate of being magnanimous in victory, that if the left wins, if Democrats win, they should take the high moral ground and not make the mistakes they made before, as I mentioned earlier, and also not treat the right the way the right is now treating the left, to break the cycle, as I said. That's what I think is the right position and the moral position, but sometimes I doubt that. And sometimes I struggle and I wrestle with this, and I'm like, the Trump administration is so horrible on so many counts in ways that even I, and I think most of us wouldn't have anticipated, that there's almost a part of me that if Democrats win in 2028, it's just like, fuck it. Let's punish the right. Let's take the low road. Let's do what they did to us to them, because that's the instinct that I had, and especially after the kind of post Charlie Kirk moment, when I saw how the right was weaponizing his death to kind of demonize the entire left, like the entire left was responsible for this murder in a way that I thought was very dangerous and still is. I just felt like, what's the point? Like, seriously, what's the point of us playing fair if they're never going to play fair? And that is something that I felt coming from me, and it scared me that my own ideals that I've cherished for so long, in this moment of political heat, I was starting to question myself. I don't know where I'm going with this exactly, except to say that I think it's each individual's duty to resist that, because we're going to feel it time and time again. This desire to defeat and vanquish our enemies. It's so tempting. It's part of human nature, especially when your enemies are actually bad. That's what, yeah. And so I think it's going to be really hard for us to maintain our ideals, to stand up for free speech, to be consistent, but it has to be seen as this kind of ongoing battle to not kind of descend into that darker place, because if I let that darker impulse take hold of me, then there's no way out. And we just have to remember, is that the country that we want to live in, where there's this constant vicious cycle of hate and hate and hate? They're not going to break the cycle, so it's got to be us.
Yeah, and I'll draw this back to the question you asked me earlier. The thing that drew me, having been raised liberal, atheist, by immigrants in a cosmopolitan East Coast city, to the right, which everyone in my whole life told me was bigoted and backward and stupid and backwater and everything that one should avoid. What drew me is my actual encounters with people who, on the right in that time, offered an ability to talk about things in a free political way, to talk about ideals without resorting to us versus them. And that's certainly obviously not always going to be the case on the right, and hasn't been. I completely agree with Shadi that resisting that impulse to forestall political disagreement. The Nazis had a famous phrase that, like, the great debate is over. Like, they were frustrated with intellectualism, they were frustrated with endless dialogue. And honestly, I understand. Everyone can understand that, right? It's like, how long do we have to debate like basic things with our political adversaries? But when I say that things are sort of pre-political, what I mean is like if somebody views their political goals, their ideals, as more important than their position on political violence, more important than their belief that other people have a right to reason and to think that other people are even capable of reason, I don't want to engage in their political project at all. And Epictetus said that there's no thief in the night that can come and steal your ideals. And so no matter what the right does or the left does, they can't change what you hold dear when your ideals are. And if your ideals, holding on to them, involve compromising those ideals that you said you have, Shadi, then it's a Pyrrhic victory. You will live in the perfect progressive or right-wing utopia, but the things you did to get there, the things you wanted to continue to love and talk about, like my love of history and philosophy, art and literature, would not be as robust as it could be if I had to stomp all over other intellectuals to get there, right? I think the idea is not to be more tolerant, but to be more aggressive and disagreeable and full-hearted in the way we talk about ideas. And so there's nothing that can ever take your virtue away from you. Socrates said this as well. And so you can't say that the Jews or the left or the right or the women or the men or the sensitive young men came and took away your ability to be a democratic citizen. You should live and die by that principle, or you should, decide that's not the country you want to live in and then pursue that vision. But I'll disagree with you.
With that, let's thank Shadi and Mana. Before we go, we have an issue we have to settle. New York versus DC. What does DC have that New York doesn't have? Other than the Hill and all those things, that whatever they do there. Culturally, what does DC have? How can you kind of like convert me to like DC a little?
I resent the question, and I adore you, Stephen, but I resent the question. And I think that those who live in DC, they are called and chosen, and so this is the appeal of living here. I can't help you, but the one thing I will say is that I did live in New York and I did not like it. And all of my friends who know me well know that I'm very pro DC. I think one thing I'll say that it might be a bit provocative, but you could agree with whether or not you agree with part of the sentiment, is that I think the United States is an incredible historical experiment, epoch, whatever you want to call it. And I do think Washington, especially now that all of our culture is fundamentally political, I don't like that, but that's the case, right? So it's the heart of this American empire. And you may not like that it's an empire, and you may think it's an empire that's declining. But when I drive down Independence or Constitution and I see the Capitol building, or I see the National Archives, and I see the federal architecture that was erected to represent some sort of ideal, I think that whether it's declining, whether we like it or not, whether we think it should be an empire, we have the opportunity, I have this rare privilege to live in this place, in this world, in this period of history, and to be part of it, when that I was by no means guaranteed. And each of us could be a Virgil or a Horace or a Cicero or an Augustus, but we could be, we're contributing to perhaps the most intellectually and historically important place, among maybe a couple others, depending on what your perspective is, in the world right now and also in human history. So I think that's going to speak for DC's favor. It also has a lot of free museums.
Okay, I am very pro DC, although I have been souring on it a little bit more recently, but that's maybe for complicated reasons. As you get older, you start to think, wouldn't it be great to just live a quieter life somewhere where politics doesn't dominate everything? I'm in the odd position of being someone who writes for politics for a living, who actually at some fundamental level, I don't think I actually like politics. And I don't know how I'm going to work that out for the rest of my life. That's to be determined. What I do like about DC is that there are things like this. You go to house parties and you meet people, usually, at least not everyone is of the same view. There is a mix of right and left, at least at some of the parties that I go to. I don't know about you guys, and the cool thing too is everyone you meet is at least like vaguely interesting. They're doing interesting things. They care about the world. They know about maybe certain philosophical issues. They're like intellectually oriented in a way that I think is very rare in most cities. That can be overbearing and a little bit annoying, but it is good to see people who actually still haven't lost hope. They're probably here in DC because they still believe in the American project. And I think that this is where America will end up being better or worse based on what people in DC do. So that really matters, and we're all a part of that.
Let's hear it for DC then. That's kind of convincing. A little bit. All right, so before we go, let's thank Sud House for hosting this event. So just stick around. We have until like 9:30 if you want to get a drink. We encourage you guys to exercise your freedom of speech. You can dialogue, you can debate, just don't beat each other up. In the back, we have a table with merch. We're selling Cracks and Pomo merch, zines, Shadi's book, a book that I contributed to. We have free stickers, all kinds of cool stuff. But thank you all for coming out tonight.